everyone. Welcome to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices and masters alike. I am Dan, and my co-host, of course, is the Earthdawn line developer, Josh Harrison.
Good evening, everyone.
He's actually one of the line developers. It is a team effort, as Josh will point out numerous times throughout the last podcasts and on going forward in that. This podcast is discussing all things Earthdawn, magical and mechanical. Today, I believe, is mostly mechanical, not geographical and not whimsical or fantastical, but we'll go from there.
We'll get a excuse me, we'll get a little bit of whimsy in here towards the end, I expect.
Oh yeah, well, I get a little punch drunk. If you'd like to ask us any questions, we have had some feedback before. We'd like to hear from you, of course. Contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. This episode, we're going to cover some game basics, where the numbers come from, some GM advice for you as well, how to use those, and maybe, if we have time, we might get into some windlings. So,
yeah, there we go. There. And sort of to piggyback onto the, feel free to send us feedback as well. If you would be so kind, if you are enjoying the show, to leave ratings and or reviews at your podcast feed source of choice. That sort of thing, feeds the almighty algorithm. And that's how people who might be looking for Earthdawn information in the future can stumble across our little show.
Love it.
And of course, like, share, and subscribe, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, all that stuff. And we cannot bribe you, but we hope you like us anyway.
Oh, we bribe them with quality information.
This is a
delivered in an entertaining fashion.
This is a semi-official Earthdawn podcast. We've never actually announced that before, but this is semi-official only because
we mentioned that, I think, in the first episode, the intro, when we were talking about what our goals were for this.
Yes.
That it was semi-official because I do have at least some. I can speak from a place of authority, but this is something that is not officially supported or endorsed by my masters, my dark masters at Facet Games.
Yes, and
but that's okay. We've been talking about working on stuff like this and projects that we might do along similar lines. One other thing, in sort of response to the feedback that we got on our previous episode about the doing a shorter elevator pitch. I have recorded, it's about 4 minutes long, an audio, like, sort of intro. I did some reworking on basically what is like the intro essay at the beginning of the player's guide. And so I have that, and I will put that up in the feed here. But the other thing that I am doing is actually working on making a video to go along with it that will go up on YouTube, inspired by the video that the Dark Sun video that the guy who suggested that linked to us.
Nice.
Getting some really, really basic animation stuff by Photoshop tricks. And so I am working on that. I think I've got the audio's all recorded. Now it's just a matter of getting the pictures all put together and trying to squeeze that in the midst of, my official duties, which, real world job and official duties, which right now involve translating the German text on the BarSafe poster map into English, and various other things.
Yeah, which shall be named later as they go through the pipeline. So really, the first thing we're going to talk about today is kind of where we should have started a while ago, and we plotted out like 12 or 13 episodes and forgot this thing entirely, which was kind of how to build a character and where your numbers come from.
Yeah, we're going to kind of cover the real sort of basics of, like, running through, here's the stuff you see on your character sheet, what is sort of what it means for some of the stuff, where it comes from, and why it might be more or less important depending on what your objectives are. Yeah. And then kind of once we've gone through that, we're going to shift into a little bit of GM advice for people who are going to be running the games and maybe helping people build their character for the first time. Mm-hmm. Things to watch out for and advice on how to help people get the character that they want without necessarily having them be broken or unplayable in negative ways.
Yes.
Because broken in positive ways is awesome.
We love those.
Broken in negative ways reduces fun, and reduced fun is anathema.
Yeah, we don't like that at all because people don't want to come back and play. And the whole goal of this is to get your players to keep playing and bring more players and expand.
That's right.
Yes, so that's what we're going for.
And spread the corruption.
I was going to go with joy, but we'll go with corruption. That works too. Potato,
well, joy is a horror, so there you go.
Potato. Exactly. So really, the main thing. So I remember in first edition it was mostly dice rolls, but I think you could point value your character together.
Right. In first edition, they offered both point build and random roll.
Yes.
That the random roll method was dropped from third and fourth edition primarily for concerns of space. Just because there's so much stuff that needs to get in the book, saving half a page on, hey, you roll 4d6, drop the lowest. I mean, that's a fairly standard sort of thing. You can still do that if you want. It's fine.
It's your game.
It's your game. And as we'll discuss here shortly, the range of attributes that you're looking for kind of fall into that. The only potential downside of if you're going to do a random roll method is that dice are sometimes fickle and unpleasant things.
Yes.
And you can end up with a situation where one person rolls really well and has fantastic or better than average scores across the board, and somebody else rolls poorly and is struggling to sort of make a character that is workable for what they want. The advantage to a point buy system is that everybody starts off at the same level in terms of how many resources they have to allocate.
Yeah.
And that can, obviously somebody who has more experience with the system is probably going to be able to make that go a little bit farther than someone who is new. But at least at that point, you're not going to be looking at somebody who is D&D speaking the equivalent of like 3 18s against someone whose highest score is a 12. You're not likely to end. You're not going to end up with that in a point buy system.
No,
but
D&D strength always drove me nuts.
Well, Earthdawn has its equivalent.
Well, no, D&D, when you get to that 18 strength, you get to roll a percentile table again. So it's one of those 18 plus. I'm like, this is just stupid.
Yeah, that if you are a fighter type and you have an 18, then you can roll percentile and bump
it up even higher. I'm just like, nope, sorry,
I thought you were talking about how in some regards strength is very overrepresented in its impact on the game. And Earthdawn does sort of have that, but it's not strength, it's dexterity.
Yes, dexterity is a wonderful umbrella that many things fall underneath.
Speaking of which...
but, so in 4th edition, and I know this probably came from 3rd as well, if my memory serves me, and it may not, we have now basic racial attributes to start from, to point build off of, so that way the races are at least differentiated across the board as a starting point, and then they can be leveled out and evened out as need be with the points.
Right. Yeah. In first edition, you sort of got the pool of build points, and everybody bought off of the same table in terms of their base attributes, and then applied racial modifiers after.
Yes.
Third edition sort of introduced the idea of, well, we're going to start everybody at a little bit higher baseline. Reduce the total number of build points available, sort of have some of those spent right off, and then have the racial modifiers applied to those base scores so that you don't need to worry about that, after the fact. So it's, so that, for example, the human basically as the sort of baseline template starts with a 10 in every attribute, and then other races start higher or lower in those depending on whether they have modifiers or not. For example, elves under previous editions had a +1 modifier to certain stats, and so instead of 10s in 4th edition, they start at 11. So they get a slight edge in that regard. One other thing that I do want to mention before we get into the specifics of like what the different attributes are and what they're important for and stuff is that unlike in some games, and by some games, of course, I'm talking about D&D.
in the game that shall not
just D&D.
Yeah.
Attributes in Earthdawn are kind of important, but they are not the be all and end all. They, especially as you advance your character and you get into higher and higher circles, your character's talents and other abilities become a little bit more important than their attribute scores. So that is something that, like, you don't necessarily need to worry about, like, maxing out. I know people there are people whose build philosophy is to try and max out like the most important stats as high as they can. And that's certainly a valid approach. One of the things about the 4th edition build system, and this is largely taken from 3rd, is that because you don't have as many points and you start off with a little bit of a higher baseline, you basically can't really handicap your character seriously in any particular attribute in a way that would long-term be detrimental to your character's survival. I've toyed with maybe variations on the system where we setting the baseline a little bit lower and offering more points and stuff like that. And they all kind of ended up roughly in the same place. And that may be because of my philosophy, which I'm sure will come out as we discuss this stuff. But, it's the only drawback of the build system as it is right now, I think, is that you can't really give yourself, like, you can't make a stupid character. Well, you can't.
You have to try really hard.
But that is to say, you can't make a character whose attributes indicate that they are stupid. Like, you don't have, you're typically not going to end up with, like, the intelligence 5 character kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that.
No, fair enough. There's only so much minning and maxing you can possibly do, because there's only 6 numbers to play with. It's not like you've got to fill in 10 or 15. You've only got 6 numbers that kind of have to be balanced out. And whatever you don't use points on, you just throw into karma at the end. But
yeah, I have yet to myself make a character that actually takes advantage of that. Because of the way the build point system is, I can usually find a place to drop that odd point at the end to bring something up a little bit.
Oh, I agree. I've never had one where I've dropped the extra points into karma, because I've done this long enough, and so have you, that I don't really want to have a really low attribute anywhere as much as possible, because all of them are valuable in some way eventually.
Right, which we will cover here.
Yeah.
If we ever get around to it.
Yeah, we'll get around to it. Not necessarily at first circle, but second and third, man, everything balances out. You kind of all need them there. So if you look at your player's guide, and I'm looking at mine, I know you've got yours up here and so forth and so on. So once you get your numbers down and you kind of figure out what you want to do, the odd thing about Earthdawn is, yeah, go ahead and get your numbers, but really you got to have your discipline figured out first.
Right.
And then your race may be second. So it's like 1 and 1A.
Right. Yeah. Basically, I mean, you kind of need to know when you go into building your character, the idea is that you know what you are going to be making, like what discipline you're going to follow, what race you're going to be, because your starting point for your attributes and where you want to put your points on those attributes are going to be, are going to play on that, right? Like if you're going to be a sword master, if you're going to be a close combat character, you're going to want to put more points into the attributes that are important for that character, dexterity, strength, charisma, so as opposed to, say, a magician or spellcaster who would be looking more at perception and willpower. So you do kind of need to make those decisions ahead of time, and it's possible maybe to tweak it as you're going along, but the like all editions of Earthdawn have basically assumed that you decide what you are going to play as the first step in building your character, so that you know what you're doing with all those points. It's not so much okay, I'm going to roll my 6 ability scores and see what I got, what high results I got, see if I qualified for any of the more unusual classes. And, oh, I got a high wisdom. Well, I guess I'll play the cleric. There isn't any of that. Even if you are using the random rolling, unless you're doing some kind of real, like, heading out there, I'm good. Like, you're going to roll your attributes straight down the line and, whoa, sorry, that is my cat making a racket.
It's a cat avalanche.
Whether you're going to go like do some kind of unusual, like you're going to roll your stats straight down the line, and that is going to sort of determine what discipline your character is more suited to. And that is an approach. I think that, there certainly random chance can can generate a certain amount of creativity, especially if you're feeling a little bit stuck for some reason. But the default in Earthdawn is that you will know what discipline and race you are going to be playing before you start spending points, so that you know what you are going to be spending those points on.
Yeah. So my first suggestion for any GM out there is, when you're introducing Earthdawn at all, before anybody rolls any dice, first question you ask your players is, what do you want to do? What do you want to play? What's the idea you've got in mind to approach this game? I have a friend who starts off every single game he possibly can with playing some kind of an archer or long range work. So he can just kind of take things in from afar. He can get used to the combat system at a distance, not necessarily up close. And that's his approach. So he always comes in as an archer first. So kind of go from there. So yeah, once you have your discipline figured out, or your race, like I said, 1 and 1A is your questions there, then it's time to roll your dice and you get them all figured out. So really, we can just kind of go down the list. Dexterity is first. And
dexterity, yes.
For most people, it's kind of the most important.
Yeah, so dexterity is as it is very similar to dexterity from D&D, which is that it is sort of related to your character's speed, agility, hand-eye coordination, fine motor control, stuff like that.
Running, all the athletic things you need to get done.
Yeah, sort of athletic related stuff. The one thing that is different is that all of the physical combat abilities, so whether you're firing a bow, whether you're throwing a dagger, whether you're stabbing somebody with a sword or trying to just punch them in the face, all of your physical combat abilities are based off of dexterity. It's basically related to hand-eye coordination. So dexterity is important for any character that is going to be involved in physical combat in any way. So
all of them:
swordmaster, warrior, archer, thief, even scout. Anybody that is basically going to be trying to do grievous physical injury with close combat or ranged attack.
Yes.
It is not the only thing that is important, but your ability to hit somebody
depends
in combat
depends on your dex.
It depends on your dexterity. And on the flip side of that, it is important for kind of almost everybody, because dexterity also determines, and we're kind of like talking about the derived stats here a little bit as part of this. It also determines how easy you are to be hit by physical attacks. So the higher your dexterity, the more likely you are to be able to dodge or avoid an attack that's coming your way. So even if your character is not one that is, if you're planning on playing a spellcaster, dexterity can still be kind of important, because there are times when you are, through one way or another, going to be up close and personal with the bad guys. And having a higher dexterity to make yourself a little bit more difficult to hit with that sword is certainly a consideration. Obviously, there are things that will be more important overall, but shorting dexterity is, generally speaking, a bad idea for just about anybody.
Yeah, that's a fool's errand. I did have one instance where I had a spellcaster who was casting spells, and a thief snuck up on him from behind, and he did not have a very high dexterity, so his physical defense was low. And yeah, the thief did his backstabbing type thing, and it worked. So you never know what situation you're going to be in. High dex benefits everybody across the board. So second, as we mentioned before, is strength, which of course is really helpful to just not the D&D bend bars lift gates, which I always hated.
It is again fairly equivalent to the D&D, where D&D had strength sort of be the primary trait involved with physical combat or with close combat, melee combat.
Yes.
Where your attack and damage rolls in close combat were based off of your strength. And so consequently having a high strength was important. Strength in Earthdawn basically determines how much damage you do when you hit somebody with your sword or bow or fist.
Yeah.
It also determines how much weight you can carry without being encumbered, if you are the sorts of people who keep track closely of that sort of thing. I must admit, I've never been a huge fan of tracking every last copper of encumbrance, but it is something that you'll want to keep in mind. If your character does have a lower strength, you'll need to pay attention to what you might have as the armor you're wearing, because you might be limited in what you can protect yourself with if you've only got so much ability to bear a heavy load.
Especially, and this may come into play later, with windlings. Because windlings don't necessarily have the highest strength because they're also airborne and they can't necessarily carry all that. So I've never paid attention to encumbrance as far as trolls or orcs or obsidian, barely humans. Dwarves maybe, but hardly ever. So really, if your character is below 4 feet tall, that's when I'm beginning to worry about it.
The other time to worry about it again is if you've got somebody who is playing more of a support type, whether that's a spellcaster or a troubadour or somebody like that who is going to be putting their points elsewhere. They might be somewhat limited in what armor and weapons and how much gear they can be lugging around themselves.
Yeah.
Something to sort of keep an eye on.
Yeah.
The other thing,
yes.
The other thing that we didn't mention with dexterity is that it also determines how quickly you act in combat. Your initiative is based off of your dexterity.
One of the derived stats,
and that is penalized by how heavy your armor is. So if you have a character that has a high dexterity but is wearing plate armor, they are actually going to end up penalized and acting more slowly in each combat round on average, because they will they'll have that initiative penalty. So
fair.
Strength is strength is probably one of the, if you are not playing a character who is intended to do close combat or physical combat damage, you can probably leave your strength more or less as is, or bump it up a point or two maybe. Again, it depends on what you're looking at in terms of armor, largely, that you might be wearing. But it's really only important for people whose primary method of interaction is going to be through hitting stuff.
Bludgeon,
Although strength, the other thing that strength is involved with is avoiding knockdown. We'll cover this, I think, probably at a later date at some point. But if you take enough damage from a single hit, you might be knocked down, and the way that you resist that is a strength-based test. So that is somewhat important. But again, if you're not generally going to be in close combat mixing it up with the bad guys, you're probably okay. You would be better off putting points into dex to make yourself harder to hit than it would be boosting your strength.
Yes. So I always number between those two, I always go dexterity first and strength second.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to hit them. I can keep hitting them, maybe do minimal damage, versus miss one hit and do, massive. So I'd rather...
Yeah, you may not, depending on how things go, you may not get that one chance to hit them and do a lot of damage, if things go badly.
Yeah,
so.
my method is chip away at the stone, because eventually that'll fall. But that's me. And my favorite one on the list actually is toughness. out of the 6. The first 3 are all physical: dexterity, strength, and toughness. I like toughness the most because it's more versatile, to use another Earthdawn term, in what it actually represents, because from toughness you get your mostly your health ratings and your recovery ability as well. So it's all regarding health.
Yeah.
So you get
health and endurance. It also relates to your ability to, as part of sort of being related to health, it also relates to your ability to, for example, resist poison and disease. That sort of thing. Toughness is another one of those that is just broadly useful, because so much of the Earthdawn characteristics are derived from your attributes. Unlike some other games where you might have, your health pool is its own thing and kind of completely, you might get a bonus from your attributes, but it's largely completely separate from it, off on its own thing. Everybody's health pool, everybody's ability to not die when they get hit is based off of toughness. And so that's another one where, it's almost always worthwhile to, if you've got a point or two at the end, every point that you put into toughness makes it a little bit harder, allows you to stand up a little bit longer. Now, for player characters, it's not as super crucial long term, except when it comes to healing damage, because you get all player characters get an ability called durability, which basically is the Earthdawn equivalent of the hit point inflation from more traditional fantasy games.
Yes.
And so, as your character gains experience, you will get more and more health ratings that allow you to take damage longer. And that's where you'll sort of see the difference. Like, spellcasters don't get as much as close combat types, because they're supposed to be up in the front line mixing it up, and so consequently need a larger health pool to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah, so that's based upon your discipline, not your race or not your toughness. But the one thing I love about Earthdawn versus most other games is it has one threshold that I haven't seen pretty much anywhere else based upon toughness, which is your unconsciousness rating versus your death rating. And you hit unconsciousness first because if you've seen it in the movies, somebody passes out, but they're still alive, and then they get rescued by, evac choppers or whatnot. But this is the fantasy version of that. I've not seen it in many other games, if ever, where your toughness dictates you have an unconsciousness rating certainly below your death rating, and there's always a gap there.
Yeah. Games that have a more traditional hit point style mechanic, like D&D, quite frequently will have, 5th edition D&D, for example, introduced death saves, where when you hit 0 hit points, you are unconscious and you're not dead yet, and there is a chance whether you will stabilize or die. And so there's the old style -10 hit points from 2nd edition where you weren't actually dead until you were is a common house rule.
Yes.
Where 0, you weren't dead. You weren't actually dead until -10. So there have been a lot of house rules and things there that kind of have that buffer space between unconsciousness and death, just not necessarily as explicit and baked into the mechanics right off the way that you have in Earthdawn.
Yeah. So that's why I like toughness, is it builds all of that in there. And then my second favorite part is the wound threshold. How many points do you have to take in a single hit to actually take a wound that affects your other performance? And I don't remember wounds being in a lot of other games as well either, because yes, something should affect the way you're doing as far as you keep getting battered like by Muhammad Ali in the corner there. Something should be affecting your ability to perform in combat. So
D&D never really had anything like that. Other games did have, depending on the damage, escalating penalties. Shadowrun, for example, would have penalties that would accrue based on how many boxes of damage you had.
Right.
Some other games will have negative effects that go along with more serious injury. Even a fairly rules light game like Fate, has something along those lines where if you suffer with the game's equivalent of a wound, which is, what's called a complication, it kind of describes something that can then have a mechanical effect down the road if it, gets tagged. And and I'm not sure I used the right term there. So Fate fans, I like the game, but I'm not up on the terminology.
No, we're talking Earthdawn. That's yeah.
Right, we're talking Earthdawn here. So there is that, but it does also create a little bit of a, delineation between the, largely just kind of exertion and minor bumps and scrapes, as opposed to the more serious, legitimate, potentially life-threatening injuries.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. I'm done with that. So yeah, toughness gets you your death rating, unconsciousness rating, your wound threshold, your recovery tests per day, and your recovery dice. So right there, 5 major things all built off your toughness. So don't skip on your dex, and don't skip on your toughness.
Don't skip on others. The recovery dice and the recovery tests, you basically, depending on your toughness score, you get a number of recovery tests per day, and for each of those you get to roll your toughness die. So the higher your toughness value, the higher the step, the bigger the die you're rolling, the more you can potentially heal from that. It's kind of similar to, I think I mentioned this in an earlier episode, to the healing surges that appeared in one edition of D&D. The way that on a short rest, for example, in 5th edition, you can spend hit dice to heal damage as well. Mm-hmm. You have a number of hit dice equal to your level, and you can use those to heal damage during certain circumstances. There's a similar kind of theme there. The Earthdawn doesn't tend to give you more recovery tests. Mm-hmm. There do tend to be ways to boost the result that you get from those recovery tests that you have.
Yeah. So the other half, as we are getting into this one, the other half of these attributes you have are beginning with perception, which is a broader term than I thought it was going to be. This actually represents your intelligence. Plus is
this is where I think the name of the attribute is intentional. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, perception is viewed as the equivalent to intelligence from D&D. I don't think it's quite the same. In that, when I was saying that it's really hard to make a stupid character, I think that the way that you make a stupid character in Earthdawn is not necessarily by shorting their perception, but just by role-playing a character that is not so quick on the uptake.
Oh, fair.
That you can have that be that actual intelligence, which is something that even in the real world is really, really hard to define and quantify.
Yeah.
That basically what perception does, it does represent mental quickness. So it's sort of kind of a mental parallel to dexterity, ability to notice things. Its association with intelligence, because it is probably the most important stat for spellcasters, mm-hmm. Is well deserved, and so that kind of goes along with that. But yeah, so perception is the primary stat for people who are going to be slinging spells, and it is also the attribute from which a character's mystic defense is derived, and the mystic defense is basically equivalent to physical defense. Physical defense is how hard it is to hit you with physical attacks. Mystic defense is how hard it is to hit you with mystic attacks, usually spells, but almost any kind of spell-like ability will quite often target a character's mystic defense.
Especially horror powers, I believe.
Horror powers, things like that. Anything that's sort of kind of a magical assault of some kind, whether it's a horror or some other kind of magical creature or whatever.
Yeah, so in my game, we also use roll your perception a lot, just to see if you can notice something.
Yeah. The perception attribute is basically the one that is rolled to notice stuff happening. Mm-hmm. And consequently, it is important, therefore, for not just magicians who will use it to cast spells, but also scouts who will be using it to scout. Yep. Thieves who will be using it to find traps and stuff like that. And those sorts of things. Troubadour, it's kind of important for if you're going with a more kind of scholarly, research-oriented approach. So, that's good. Perception is one that if you are not playing a sort of more mentally proficient character, you can probably get away with not doing much with it in terms of your build points. But understanding that, if you short yourself and you end up as a result with a lower mystic defense, you are potentially going to be more seriously affected by any kind of magical attacks.
Yeah.
So again, the trend continues here of, you don't want to really short yourself too seriously, because it is one of the, physical defense and mystic defense are like the two key traits for your character that are derived from attributes and not modified quite so much by this, not modified as significantly by the stuff your character picks up as their adventuring career goes on. I mean, they can be modified through talents and magic items and stuff like that, but generally speaking, you don't want to hamper yourself too much if at all possible.
No. So I like Earthdawn above other games because this forces you almost, if you really are resistant to it, fine, but this almost forces you to create a very well balanced character just in your 6 attributes, so that you can be broad across the board and have a nice base to go from. That way you're like, oh great, I'm up against these things again and I'm going to die because they killed me last time this way. No, because one of your defenses is too low. That's not the case.
Right.
But leading into the next one.
And again, this one of the things that is the result of the way that attribute purchases have been, done in the more recent editions is it is, really hard to really get yourself a dangerously low defense rating. The way that the system is built sort of by default kind of prevents that from happening as a safety valve. And again, it's part of the reason why I had toyed with alternate creation systems with the numbers sometimes, because I do want to give more experienced players who might know what they're doing the opportunity to take something a little bit lower, knowing what that could potentially mean for their character. I don't want to see that happen to a new player.
No, I agree entirely. So 2 more to go. Willpower, and me being a Green Lantern fan, this is one of my favorites to use, but willpower is kind of a hidden gem in there. It's not just resisting things, or in the case of D&D, like saving throw type stuff. This is more of the oomph you get to put behind your spells.
Yeah.
And so
that's its one of its primary game mechanical functions is it for spells that have a variable result, as opposed to like just providing a flat bonus to something, will frequently be based off of willpower. It is a function of your concentration, your determination, your ability to just kind of like push through and to mentally endure the stresses and so forth that might go along. It is any time that you are typically resisting some kind of magical effect, like if a horror is trying to affect you with magical fear, it is a willpower test or a talent based on willpower that you will be using to resist it. And that is true for anything that might affect your character's ability to do something. That is to say, as opposed to like say being like restrained, where you might be tied up and you would be using strength perhaps to try and break the ropes. Willpower is when you are being sort of
charmed
mentally, like in a sort of mental exhaustion, or charmed, or anything where your mind is being affected in some way.
Yeah.
But that's largely in relation to spell and magical attacks, because there's a little bit of overlap in that regard with the last attribute.
Yes.
Which we'll get to in a sec. But one other thing I want to say about willpower is that willpower is probably similar to strength, and that is that if you don't have a character who has talents and stuff that are based on it, you're probably safe to not do much with it. It does determine your mystic armor, which is a little bit of damage reduction from any kind of purely mystical spell attacks that you might have.
Yes.
But those values tend to be on the lower side anyway. So, ending up with a lower than average score, or an average, ending up with an average score as far as sort of the human baseline is measured, is not going to be overly crippling.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever created a character that has more than 3 points naturally of mystic armor. So if you get one at all, great. From willpower.
I don't recall right off the top of my head previous editions, but natural mystic armor that is derived from willpower basically caps out at 3 for player characters.
Yeah,
you need to get into attribute values of 20 and up to have a 4 natural mystic armor, which is not possible with a starting character under any of the builds that I'm aware of, and is possible if you max it out and then spend more points to raise it, but I have not ever really seen that before.
No, I can't think of off the top of my head why you would want to.
Because again, if you've got somebody where willpower is going to be important, perception is likely to also be important.
Yes.
And so you will end up putting points into, like, willpower supplements a whole lot of useful stuff. It is not a primary attribute on its own.
No, like I said, it's a hidden gem. So if you find value in it, or you're building your character just right, then by all means, sink some points there. But really, as you said, it has some small overlap with charisma. And around my table, we've often said charisma is not a dump stat in Earthdawn.
No, no, it is not.
No, because
it may not be super useful to a character who is not socially oriented, but there's a lot of stuff that kind of ties into it. It determines the third defense rating, which is social defense, which represents how easy it is for you to be deceived, lied to, fast talked, taken advantage of in a sort of a social situation, or if a merchant is trying to make more money off of you. If you've got a low charisma and you're trying to sell loot from a that you've recovered from a care. If you've got a low charisma, you are not likely to get as good a price on that stuff as you are if you have a higher charisma. Obviously, charisma is very important for troubadours, sword masters as well, because they are as much flash as they are finesse. But it's also useful for beastmasters, who will be using it to interact with their animal companions. Cavalrymen, because they likewise have an animal companion. Nethermancers and elementalists, it's kind of important because they will be using that to interact with spirits if your game is going to be dealing with spirits, which it should, because spirits are awesome.
There you go.
Weaponsmiths, because they are while not blatantly so, are a social, are a civic-minded discipline, based kind of around the community and the social position that they have there. And it's useful for any kind of character that you think is going to be a leader or face character of any type, even if that's not necessarily going to be their primary thing.
Yeah, because I think a lot of talents like battle shout and the like that are involved in almost pre-combat or to boost your allies as well are based upon charisma.
A lot of them are, yeah, because not only does it represent your ability to sort of resist your being deceived and fast-talked and persuaded, it also indicates your ability to do those things to others. And so someone who has a higher charisma is going to have an easier time socially manipulating their targets one way or the other. I mean, even if it doesn't seem obvious, a thief with a high charisma is basically a con man.
Yes.
Someone who is using their social wiles to take advantage of and steal from other people.
Yeah, and
so I mean, it is a score. It is an attribute that can be useful to just about anybody, and you almost certainly, largely just by default, are almost certainly going to have a character or two in your typical group that is going to have a higher charisma score.
Yes.
But basically, anything that doesn't target perception, anything that doesn't target mystic defense, but is kind of mentally, is going to target social defense. So again, not something you necessarily want to short unless you know what you're doing and are willing to play a character where that is going to be an issue.
Yes. And I love Earthdawn for the simple fact that it was one of the first games I ever came across that had a social defense. So instead of just letting people occasionally just role play it back and forth and going, well, no, I'm just going to shut my eyes and cross my arms and go, no, I just said no, and there's all there is to it. This actually gives you a stat to roll against to say, nope, this is a convincing argument. Your character's going to believe this, and at least goading that player into not being so much of a hidebound jerk.
That is really cool, but it does start to stray into a territory of player agency and some potentially difficult situations where you kind of take control of a character, and that's one of those session zero things. You need to figure out where your group stands as a whole at the table with regards to the character, having the ability to have their have their mind changed. Like, to what degree are you going to allow that? Are you largely going to deal with, charisma and your social defense is largely going to be interaction with abilities like taunt and things like that are giving you penalties to other tests that you might be making? Or is it going to be a situation where, you can get somebody with a high charisma to, some of the high charisma abilities that you get in Troubadour and Swordmaster and stuff like that are potentially game breaking if somebody knows what they're doing. Because with high charisma and the appropriate knowledge and abilities, you can basically raise an army, in support of you. It's not necessarily easy, but when you've got magic, it can become a lot easier. And so, a properly built social character can potentially be very broken if the person knows what they're doing and the GM is not careful.
If you know how to leverage your talents along with your attributes, you can maneuver the game in your direction.
And that is lest we say, charisma is broken. That is true of anybody who knows who knows what their character is capable of doing and is able to shape it appropriately in the circumstances in which they shine.
Absolutely.
But the overall the broad the broad strokes of the attributes, a couple of them are less important, relatively speaking, for certain character archetypes, strength and willpower, charisma to a lesser extent. But because in some respects, all sorts of things are derived off of those attributes, it's generally a bad idea, unless you know what you're doing, to have a low score in any of them.
Yeah. Like I said, it pays to have a well-balanced character in the long run to get all those things done. So really, the only thing we didn't cover is armor, because none of those attributes actually give you any actual armor, including Obsidian. It does not give you an actual armor. Obsidian get a racial ability of a +3 wound threshold, and
they also get some natural armor, but that's not tied to any of their attributes.
So they're the only ones who actually get natural armor, but everybody else has to actually buy some.
Has to actually buy it and wear it. We did touch on mystic armor, which is sort of the magical equivalent of that, which is based on willpower, but that tends to be a little bit lower compared to physical armor. But yeah, we kind of covered in the course of that, like the attributes and the things that are based on them, and why you might want to have abilities that are higher or lower, and why you might want to avoid shorting yourself in something that you might not think is important.
Yeah. So that covers the attributes, the defense ratings, the health ratings, the armor ratings, and things like that, and what those attributes are all good for. And that leads us into the next thing, which is we're about 50 minutes into the whole episode. Game mastering advice on how to help somebody build their character. Here's what I lead with, which is, well, let's figure out what you want to play, what race you want to play, and then you're going to be first circle to start. But I always tell everybody, think of a character you want to, after all these adventures are done, or after like you've hit second circle and then you hit fourth circle and then you hit sixth circle, what novel would you be writing about this character? Because I want you to go through these adventures and I want you to have these interactions. And I want you to be able to go into this tavern over here and down in this cave over here, maybe fly over the Death Sea and describe it. So I want you to create a character that you want a novel written about. Because in Earthdawn, I don't think it's wise. People have done this. Just throw me together a character and I'll play him until he dies. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to help you become a legend. And that's the overall arc of this game, is to help you become a legend. And without people telling your stories, you're not going to be a legend. So what do you want to have written about your character? And since we've all read some fantasy novels, more than likely, yeah, your character should be the main. So your character that you make should be the main protagonist in this novel. So think of the character behind that. Think of their motivations. Think of their wants and desires and why they went out into the world of Barsave to go adventuring. So that's what I usually start with. How about you?
Yeah, the character creation process as presented in the books, and this goes all the way back to first edition, while it does spend a good chunk of time on determining your attributes and your derived stats and buying your starting talents and stuff like that, does have as sort of the final step of the process, creating the character. That is determining, maybe some of the personality traits or the background, sort of playing maybe a little bit of 20 questions and things like that. Now, for new players to the game, new players who don't know the setting necessarily that well, it might be a little bit daunting to try and find answers to those questions right off. And it's okay to not necessarily have detailed answers. But maybe just kind of broadly speaking, being aware of, that kind of thing. And perhaps as a slight counterpoint to the character you are making is the protagonist of the novel that would be written about your character's adventures. Keep in mind that role-playing games are a collaborative exercise.
Yes.
And so really what you are doing is you are making perhaps one member of a group or a team that may not necessarily start off knowing each other well or working together well or anything like that. They could be like the band of strangers kind of thrown together on the whims of fate, but they're presumably going to be, working together. And so creating characters to a certain extent should also be, the numbers maybe not, but the characters that you are creating and the backgrounds and the stories that you are envisioning should perhaps be collaborative. And those discussions, again, part of a session zero, part of everybody kind of getting together and being on the same page, because you want to, I think it's a good idea to avoid a situation where one person comes into the game with expectations that do not line up with what everybody else wants.
I agree.
As an example taken from something I saw online here in the last day or two, somebody has a group where one of the players is notorious for making characters that will not fit with the rest of the group, and is approaching Earthdawn and is like, basically, he doesn't want to play an adept. He doesn't want to play a character that has magic. So, like, what do we do for that? And frankly, my answer on that is tell him that he can't do that.
Yeah.
Because he should engage with the premise of the game, which is that everybody uses magic. Because quite frankly, while you could make a mundane character, there are so many drawbacks and problems that he is going to run into. Yes. As a result of the way the mechanics are built, that he is just ultimately not going to have a good time. I don't think. I mean, if he understands what's going on and is willing to accept those, fine.
He may have a good time, but he's not going to last long.
Yeah, and
you're going to spend more time making characters than you are playing. That's just not fun either.
Yeah, we mentioned the durability trait that all adepts get. A non-adept character is not going to get that.
Nope.
And so consequently is going to end up in situations where it is likely that they will basically be outclassed by what the rest of the group is capable of dealing with.
Yes, eventually he's going to get. It's going to be outpowered.
You know, while a character, a skilled character, it is possible for them to, at least for a while, have their abilities be more, to be roughly on par with what their allies are. Mm-hmm. It takes them longer to do that. Because they have to train it the old-fashioned way. They don't have the magical ability to just meditate and improve their abilities. Mm-hmm. They're going to be. They don't have karma.
Nope.
To throw in to give them that little bit of edge. They're going to have problems as as their friends get into second and third circle and start getting another couple of hits worth of protection from their durability. Like, they are eventually going to be in a situation where it's just mechanically probably not going to be as cool for them. Now, again, if a group is willing to kind of work things out and come up with a way for that to be standard
or workable,
great, more power to you. Yeah. But I can't help but feel, and I have absolutely no idea if this is the case, but based on sort of the description of how he always does this, it feels to me like a very spotlight hoggy, semi-disruptive kind of thing where he wants to try and make things
difficult
or centered around him in some way. And it may, whatever. It might be trying to. There are a whole bunch of possible motivations, and I don't want to get into like an extensive psychological analysis of that. But like, it's just like, if this is always a problem, like to the point that I know he's going to want to do this, what is your advice? My advice is to say, come on, engage with the premise. Like, it's for example, if you're going to be playing a superhero game.
Yeah.
And you decide that you don't want to play a superhero. I mean, Earthdawn is in some ways a fantasy superhero game.
Yes.
Or for example, we're going to be playing Call of Cthulhu and everybody is going to be, like scholars and aristocrats and like things like that of kind of the typical Lovecraftian protagonist of an educated, upper middle or upper class individual, just, whatever. And one of the players decides that he wants to play an illiterate Irish dock worker.
Yeah. You're not going to be allowed
or an 11-year-old kid.
I was just going to say it.
Or something like that. That's like, again, you can get some great stuff out of those weird offbeat things, but it's
only once in a while, not every single time. And I think this guy's trying to play Pop Warner football like versus the NFL. It's just not gonna,
or just, it ends up requiring a whole lot more effort on the part of the game master and potentially the other players to make this work and have this character fit in. You really should be working together as a group to make your characters, whether that is just to make sure that you're all roughly on the same page in terms of the tone and style and backgrounds and whatnot, and find ways to connect those together, or to perhaps make sure that that the different, like, you've got your kind of smarter magician person, you've got your bruiser, you've got your face, like the same way that you would put together, say, a Shadowrun team, where you'll have your samurai and your
street mage.
Your mage / shaman, or the face, or like the decker, the rigger, whatever, that you have the kind of different roles covered. But the other thing, when it comes to, especially at Game Masters, if you're going to be introducing your players to Earthdawn for the first time, is helping them build their characters, and maybe while you don't build the character for them, you like kind of go through the process, kind of like what we did here in this episode, and saying, okay, these are the attributes, here's what's kind of based on them, and like taking a look at their points and helping, maybe fine tune. And again, not necessarily making those choices for them, but, helping to steer them so that they can kind of build the character that they're envisioning in their head. So, and along with that, just basically kind of helping them out. And also, I definitely recommend this for newer players, is offering the ability to, for lack of a better term, re-roll the character. Yeah. If something isn't working quite the way they want, especially if they're really new after the first session or two and they get a sense of what their stuff can do, okay, now that you know, like, the stuff that your character could do, and because of the points you chose maybe isn't doing as well as you wanted or whatever, then go ahead and kind of rebuild them, and we'll, kind of go from there. I think that is a very valuable option to provide to players. Experienced players probably won't need it so much because they'll know more what they're doing and be able to kind of do that from the start. But new players definitely, you want to do everything you can to make that initial experience enjoyable and relatively easy so that they are not frustrated. You want to get them to the point where they're playing and rolling those exploding dice, because those exploding dice are what hook people.
Yeah. So yeah, don't let them get frustrated or disheartened about the whole thing. And sometimes, if they're mostly inexperienced player of any games, this is their first game or second game ever, role playing in general, then I usually tell them, great, we'll make you a first character, not a throwaway character, but just to get you your feet wet, understand what the game does, and then you can make a second character that you really, really, really want to play and make that novel about. So the first character is not necessarily throwaway, but practice.
Yeah. From a purely mechanical kind of, like, let's wrap this up with some like concrete number advice. If you are making a character, my general recommendation is to shoot for a score that will give you a step 7 in your character's primary attribute. Step 7, if possible, in a secondary attribute, if there is one, like for spellcasters, perception, willpower, trying to get those both to step 7. If you can't, then go for step 6 in your character's sort of secondary thing, and then kind of, like, at that point, that will typically use up the bulk of your points depending on your race.
Yes.
And then you kind of, like, put the other points in where you can to fill out the rest of the thing. The reason for that is that just because of the way the mechanics work, you really want to, and we're not going to talk about like purchasing talents. We're not really going through the whole character creation process, but just generally speaking, you want to have at least step 8 in your character's primary shtick. You want to be rolling those 2d6 because of the way the mechanics and the probability curves work, you really want to get into those multiple dice as early as possible. And if you can do it for at least the more important stuff that you can at character creation, then you will be a lot happier, broadly speaking, with your character's performance early on.
Because they'll be more successful.
Yeah. If you can get 2 dice into everything, all the better. But generally, get into, if just because of the way that things are, you end up with a step 7 in a talent, so you're on a D12, it's not that hard to get it into the 2d6, but that's generally what you are shooting for, is getting into those multiple dice as soon as you can, because that's where the mechanics really start to do what they're supposed to. And the single dice are, they work, but they're swingy.
Yeah, it's a scale. There's always a 1 in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And those pop up more than I like.
Especially the step 7. The D12 is just, it's super swingy, and you're, again, over the long term, average-wise, it averages out, but it's a linear distribution, and so you're going to get some crummy rolls, you're going to get some really good rolls, you're going to get some stuff in the middle.
Yeah.
You really want to get into those multiple dice to get those bell curves going, where you're not quite as likely to get the extremes, but you're also more likely to see maybe individual die explosions to push your overall average up. So, like, that's my like advice number 1 for new players especially. Get those, like, the 1 or 2 primary stats for your character that their talents are based on. Step 7, if possible, as high into step 6 as you can otherwise, because you can bump them in the step 7 later, and then purchase your talents so that you're getting into those multiple dice. And then, basically and then your extra points left over, put them into things where you're, like, again, Little bit more importance maybe on dexterity, perception, or charisma, depending on the type of character you've got. Toughness is always valuable, so don't forget to skimp on that. And so if you end up putting like about 2 or 3 points into everything else to give yourself a roughly average across the board, just for your first character, you can't go wrong with that, I don't think.
No.
More experienced players, hey, if you want to put more points and end up with what for player characters would be slightly below average starting in an attribute or two, or even like spending, like lowering it even further to get you extra points to get higher. Hey, if you know what you're doing, have fun and go to it. But I definitely do not recommend that for people new to the game. And the pre-gen characters that I make for conventions and whatnot are all built off of that sort of golden rule.
Yeah. Fair. So that gets us to about an hour and 5 minutes. I think we're kind of done for this one.
I think that's a really good. Yeah, we'll maybe cover a couple. We'll talk about windlings later. We'll maybe get into other stuff. We'll start talking about like specific disciplines, getting into the things that are important for them, and looking at kind of potential build paths and like the talents and abilities that become available to them, at least over the early stages of their career. Yes. I don't know that we will necessarily get into the really high circle stuff right off. That's a little bit more advanced again, where we're kind of looking at this as the early episodes as a primer, as a way for people who may not be as familiar with the system to get their feet wet. We're going to be kind of maybe focusing more on the more basic stuff before we get into the advanced theory crafting and
it's
whatnot.
A survival guide, not a flourish and thrive guide. It's just,
Well, yeah.
Sorry, that had to be said.
Surviving the early stuff allows you to flourish.
Exactly. So we have to get to the survival part first. But by all means, drop us a line. And if you love D12s, because I'm not sure I've heard anybody ever love D12s as far as dice are concerned. Everyone loves the D20. I personally love 2D10s. But you can drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. I do want to thank Josh again for making the time to do the podcast. And thank you for keeping the Earthdawn light burning for all of us.
And I'd like to thank you all for continuing to listen and support and sharing and reviewing and rating and all of that stuff, so that we can see what's going on. We're again, multiple podcast platforms where the feed is available on. So pick the one that you like. That is absolutely fine by us. And just kind of spread the word. And the previous episode, I want to actually mention this real quickly, that went out in the feed, is a recording of the panel that we gave at Gen Con this past year, back in August 2019, which is kind of has most of the development team talking about what we were working on and stuff like that. And so you should have seen that in the feed, and forgive the audio quality of a single mic recording in a large conference room
with multiple people.
But hopefully, with multiple people. I did the best I could with the audio quality on that, but feel free to enjoy that or skip it. It's not critical, but people I thought might be interested, so I dropped it in.
Cool. Thank you for engaging, everybody, and now go make your own legend.